Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective. This is Another View.
Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Today, we bring you the controversial topic of white privilege. Joining me to talk about it is Jonathan Zur, CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. Hi, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm doing well. Nice to be with you.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today. Carla Johnson, who is a grants writer here at WHRO. And Carla, I know people are going, huh? But we'll explain later.
That's right.
Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being on this side of the glass.
Indeed.
We appreciate that. And joining us by phone is Dr. Alan Johnson, author of Privilege, Power, and Difference, and his latest book, Not From Here, Being White in America. How are you doing, Alan?
I'm fine, Barbara. Nice to be here.
Good. Thank you so much for joining us, too. So I want to start the conversation by really identifying first, what is white privilege? And Alan, I'm going to let you start.
It's a widely misunderstood concept, including some important myths about it that I find encourage white people to think that it doesn't exist. But the most straightforward definition is that it's an unearned advantage that is exclusive to a particular group of people and is socially conferred. In other words, in order to have access to the advantage, people have to identify you as belonging to the appropriate category of people. So, for example, there's all kinds of research, including just out this year, of experiments where they send in job applications, identical applications, but there are different names on them. And the Anglo-sounding name application is 50% more likely to get a callback or interview than the exact same application that has, say, Jamal Jones on it or Hector Martinez. So there's an unearned advantage operating there. One of the myths about privilege that I hear a lot about from white people is the belief that it guarantees a good life for white people, and it guarantees a bad life for people of color.
And that is
and it doesn't work that way. Because what it does is it loads the odds in favor of white people. So a white person may not get a job they're qualified for example. They may work hard their whole lives and have very little to show for it. But the odds of that happening are much lower for white people overall than they are for people of color. And just quickly, the other myth that I think is really important here is the idea that privilege is something that we have, like it's a personal possession or it's a characteristic of ours, which is not the case, because privilege is attached not to individual people, but to these socially defined characteristics, in this case, the characteristic of white, so that all you have to do to have access to it is to be perceived by people as belonging to that socially defined category, and then you're in. Okay. And if you're not put in that category, then you're not.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, then a lot of people equate it to wealth. Or equated to, if I have white privilege, I am wealthy. And I've read an article recently that was called Explaining White Privilege to a Broke White Person. What's the difference? And does it include wealth or class?
Yeah, I think people understand privileged to look a certain way based on issues of class. And when we talk about the concept of white privilege, we're really talking about access to opportunity solely based on your identity. So even if you do not have financial means, there are still ways, because you are white and walk into a particular space, that you might be treated differently. We see that a lot in schools, that students get tracked into different classes, honors and AP classes, or more likely for the same behavioral infraction to be suspended or expelled, or to simply let it go. And that's based on the visual appearance. And so that's not based on how much money you have in the bank or how much money you have in your wallet. Socioeconomic status can determine certain levels of access, but your racial identity, as it's socially constructed and understood, is another part of it.
And Alan, I want to talk to you just because you, in your book, you mentioned different areas in which white privilege exists. In terms of disabilities, in terms of gender, and so forth. But race, when you talk about it in terms of race, it seems to be such a hot-button issue. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a hot-button issue in the United States, well, at least among white people, because our awareness of the costs of racism is so close to the surface. White people, for example, I find are extremely sensitive to even the possibility that they might be accused of being racist people. Mm-hmm. And so, and their awareness of their vulnerability to that kind of charge, I think, makes them very sensitive to it. So our awareness nationally of the ongoing legacy of race in this country, I think, is a source of hypersensitivity for white people, which is why every time something happens that brings this into the forefront. I think that's why there's so much bad conversations, a lot of yelling that goes back and forth, and a lot of defensiveness and denial.
Yeah, defensiveness and denial. I was surprised as we started talking about doing this show that the most pushback that I received was from white heterosexual upper middle class men. And I was really a bit surprised, Jonathan, about why they would react so negatively towards it, as I would think they would be more, global in thought.
I did a program a few weeks ago through the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities for a college group, and it was on this very topic. And I heard repeatedly from white males who were saying, "You're just trying to make me feel guilty. Why are you trying to make me feel guilty? I'm not going to feel guilty for being who I am." And the conversation that we were trying to have was to better understand the lived experiences. Just because I can walk through the door and things are set up for me as a white male does not mean that everyone else has that same level of access. And if I'm truly going to care about others, understand the experiences of others, make informed decisions, I need to have that level of empathy and understanding about the fact that my experience is not universalized. And in fact, that white males are universalizing their experiences is an example of privilege to be able to do that.
Carla, I want to bring you into the conversation because you work here at WHRO, but you are a staunch supporter of Another View, and some things have changed in your thought pattern, have they not?
Yes. I grew up essentially in a white environment, and I was there for a very long time. As a matter of fact, I've told you this story before about my son who came home from preschool and announced that Martin Luther King Jr. had come to lunch. And I was fairly astonished at that, as he had been gone for some time. And I found out that it was somebody's dad who came to lunch, but the only picture my son had ever seen on the wall at the preschool was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
So he thought that's who it was.
Yeah, and actually, around that time as well, he walked up to a tall African-American man in a grocery store and asked him if he played basketball. And it was at that time that I said, when you go to school, we're putting you in an intentionally diverse school because, well, I was embarrassed. We moved to St. Louis, and I was really, the St. Louis area about which we have heard so much, and all of it is true. I've been gone for 10 years. But my son gave me a book about the Great Migration by Isabel Wilkerson called The Warmth of Other Suns. And this was sometime last year that I read it. And it really changed my whole way of looking at things because I did not have to learn about the Great Migration. I did not have to learn about the Jim Crow South. I just was aware of it, but it didn't really touch my life. And then I started to read intentionally about the African American experience following the Civil War. And I realized that their story and their lived history was one I had been completely unaware of. I mean, I often wondered growing up in Michigan why blacks were in Detroit, but I never gave it much thought after that. You know, how did they get to Chicago? So that really put me, that book put me on the path to more reading. And I decided to intentionally study this issue and realize where I came into it.
In the process. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. Do you believe that white privilege exists? Do you think that it is just a way to continue to divide the races? We would love to hear from you. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. I want to play a clip from StoryCorps that is an example of white privilege, and I want you guys to talk about it on the other side. And before you play it, Victor, one thing I want to point out to our audience today, this is a first for Another View because we are not talking from an African American perspective today. All of my guests are white, and I did that purposely because I think that it makes a difference in terms of how this topic is accepted. Do you agree with that, Jonathan?
I think people hear it differently. Certainly when I'm speaking about this topic versus some of my colleagues who are people of color, saying the same exact thing, groups that will respond very differently.
What about you, Alan? Do you agree with that?
Oh yes, I mean, and it's a contradiction that when I stand in front of an audience, I know I'm getting an edge of credibility that I wouldn't have if they identified me as being of color or a white female, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. So the pecking order, there is even a pecking order in that. Let's play the clip.
We never talked about race growing up. I just don't think that was ever a conversation.
I thought that love would conquer all and skin color really didn't matter. I had to learn the really hard way when they almost killed you.
I was 19 years old. I had picked up a friend, and I noticed that we had red and blue lights behind us. We were being pulled over. The officer explained I had made an illegal left turn and to step out of the car. So I get out of the car first. He pats me down, and then he goes around to the passenger side and pulls my friend Addison out of the car.
Addison is white.
Yeah, Addison is white, and he had some weed in his coat pocket, so he gets placed in handcuffs. I figure that everything's okay. I'm not in handcuffs. I've already been patted down, plus there's 3 officers on the scene, and I had never had a negative interaction with police in my life. So I asked them, can I please see a warrant before you continue the search? And they grabbed me and began to hit me in the face. I could hear Addison in the background yelling, "Stop, leave him alone." I was hit several times, and I remember gasping for air and spitting and blood flying across the grass. And then I hear an officer shout out, "He's reaching for a gun." I immediately started yelling, "No, I'm not. I'm not reaching for anything." And I remember an officer say, "If he doesn't calm down, we're going to have to shoot him." I could feel the gun pressed to my head. I expected to be shot. And at that point, I lost consciousness. I woke up to a multitude of officers just standing around me laughing. One officer was like, "Where's that warrant now, you It took 45 stitches to close up the lacerations in my face alone." How did it feel when you got the call that I was in jail?
All she said was, "You'd better come see about your son." She didn't say anything about what kind of shape you were in.
What about when you finally saw me?
All I remember is involuntarily screaming.
That was the first time I had cried the entire time I had been in there. And it wasn't my injuries that hurt. It was just seeing how it devastated you.
My whole worldview changed that night.
Yeah, for me it was the point of awakening to how the rest of the world is going to look at you. I was just another black face in the streets, and I was almost another dead black male.
That was Patsy Hathaway and her son, Alex Landau. Now, Patsy is a white woman who adopted Alex and raised him in an all-white environment, pretty much. Carly, you said that story had a profound impact on you.
I burst into tears when I heard that sort of story, because that could have been me. I mentor a black family, and I've been doing it through, and I'm going to give a shout out to the Up Center Team Up. It's a great experience. I started out with them, and then we stopped the formal part of the mentoring. But they are my other family now. They share holidays with my kids and me, and I worry about Ty. I worry about Tiana. I worry about them just like their mother does now, because I know now. I never worried about my kids. My kids were white. They could go out and come back. But I worry about them, and this story was just so moving to me.
You want to react, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think about when I was growing up, my parents told me, if don't ever do anything that's going to get you pulled over. But if you do, be respectful and do what the officer says, and you'll go on your way. That's a radically different message than I know my friends of color, colleagues of color hear from their parents because of different experiences. Now, I didn't create that as a white person. But I certainly benefit from not having to think about those things, or not having to feel the pressure or the anxiety. And there's so much power and resonance in that clip that for someone to then say, well, they're just making it up, or that doesn't exist, is really a defense mechanism. It's a way to not want to believe it rather than to really not believe it, I think.
Alan, where did white privilege come from? It's not something that we just made up one day. Can you give us the short answer in terms of the history?
I hate to tell you, but I think in some ways the answer that we just made it up one day is not too far away from the actual history of it. My understanding of the history of the idea of whiteness and the ideology of white privilege is that it was born out of a need to justify what was being done to people of color, both to Native Americans and to Africans who were being kidnapped and put into slavery. That Europeans had all kinds of contact with Africans for hundreds of years without ever thinking of themselves or Africans as being different kinds of human beings, and certainly not with inferiority and superiority attributed to those differences. it was with the beginning of the African slave trade that the idea of whiteness really took hold, and with the resistance of Native Americans to white people taking their land. That's how, for them, that's how they became converted from respected civilizations into savages and subhumans. So I think that the exploitation of people of color, the conquest of people of color, can't be separated from the development of basically an ideology that would make that appear, at least, to white people as being appropriate.
So, can people of color have privilege?
Can they have race privilege?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In this society, no,
Okay.
because this society is not organized around the privileging of people of color over white people, the elevation of people of color, and the devaluation of white people. It's not organized that way.
The reason I bring that up is because a lot of times when an African American or another person of color points out something that they feel is white privilege, then we're accused of being racist or defensive, or you're just trying to cause problems. And also, Jonathan, I'll ask you this: this is not about guilt, or it should not be about guilt.
Yeah, Peggy McIntosh has a fabulous article called "White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack," and what she says is that she was taught growing up that racism and prejudice was about individual acts of meanness. So how I treat you and how you treat me. And so there is an incredible defensiveness that I certainly have experienced as a white person over time, and I've seen others experience, because I'm not trying to be mean to other people, and I don't want other people to have negative outcomes. And yet this is really about how society is structured to grant access to some, to push some people up and push others down, solely based on aspects of identity. Again, I didn't create that as an individual, but certainly I can do things to either perpetuate and sustain it, or to work against it in the ways that I try.
Alan, I heard you in the background. Did you want to add to that?
I was agreeing with everything Jonathan was saying. And I guess the only thing I would add to it is that as a white person and as a man, I am. It's not possible for me to not be part of the problem. As long as I participate in this world, we're all part of this problem, and we may play different roles in that. We may participate in different ways, but there's no way not to participate. But at the same time, then the choice that I feel that I confront is: do I also want to make myself part of the solution? And I think that's the challenge and the choice that faces everybody in this society.
Okay, our phones are lit up: 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Mike joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Mike. You're on the air.
Hey, how are you?
Okay, how are you?
Thank you. I'm great. Thank you. This is a great conversation. I commend you all for being willing to have the communication. I definitely know for a fact that white privilege does exist, and I think it exists maybe, of course, like your male caller stated, due to control of power and, to destruction of others that didn't necessarily look like Caucasians. But ultimately, I think it continues to exist because both parties on either side of the coin, whether you benefit from it or you are a victim of it, is due to lack of education. And that's systematic as well, whether it's done through the school system or it's done through parents not really telling children the actual truth of what's happened, what really happened to blacks, how whites really benefited from what went on throughout slavery and maybe a little bit before that. So again, I'll take you guys' comments offline, but I just really appreciate the conversation.
Okay, thank you so much for calling, Mike. I appreciate it. Carla, I saw you nodding your head.
Well, I absolutely agree that it's about education, and there's an actual simmering warfare out in the country about how history is taught. And we freed the slaves, everything was fine. We don't get taught about Jim Crow. We don't get taught about mass incarceration. I remember receiving a book when I was in 10th grade, when I was taking American history, about the Battle of Wounded Knee, and feeling like I had been lied to my entire life studying American history, because we don't want those other voices out. Because it's not pretty when you look at it.
That's very true. Let's take one more call. Natasha joins us from Hampton. Hi, Natasha. You're on the air.
Hey, I'm doing well, thank you.
Uh-huh.
So I'm in an interracial marriage. My husband is half black, half white. And I guess, me coming from this all-white world, and, I'm really never truly going to understand his, as much as I can strive to and try and listen to his stories, I'm never truly going to understand where he's coming from. And I guess my question is, what's a good way to attempt to bridge the gap, especially, if we do end up having children, because I'll probably never understand what they go through if they, don't look like me.
That's a great question. Thanks, Natasha, for the call. Alan, you want to tackle that first?
First thing that comes to me is to start with yourself. That very often, did I hear this correctly? The caller is white?
Yes. Mm-hmm. She is white. Her husband is half African-American, half white, and she's worried about her kids.
The standard response for white people is to see race as an issue for people of color, but not for white people. So that in your situation, what I would want to do is to examine my own whiteness. What is my own experience as a white person in the world, which we generally are encouraged not to look at? And that would be a place to begin, because my experience in the world as a white person, of course, is deeply connected to the experience that people of color have in this world as well. And that you can know about. Mm-hmm. And that makes it, I think, an important place to begin.
I want to play another example of white privilege and then get you all's reaction to it. Let me set it up a little bit, Victor, before you play it. This is a woman by the name of Angela Jagrai, and she is talking about what happened to her in a grocery store with her sister-in-law, who is half black, but looks white. Let's play the clip.
Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, this young woman is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and says, yes. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white. So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no chatter. I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. And she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me and tears are coming up in her eye like, Mommy, you're not going to let her do this. Why is she doing this to us? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman. I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you got to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, my sister-in-law walks back over and she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point, the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space.
Jonathan, is that something that people can do in terms of using their white privilege in order to teach others?
Absolutely.
And point things out.
And I would say to even the caller who just had the comment about her relationship, there's so much about, for being white, noticing what's happening around me. Inclusion requires intention, and if I'm not being intentionally inclusive, I run the high likelihood of being unintentionally exclusive, of just not noticing what's happening. It's sort of the smog that we don't consciously breathe in smog every day, and yet it's happening. This is kind of what's around us. And so in order to really be able to address these issues, I have to notice what's happening around me and then use my voice in ways, not for other people. I think it's also important to be in relationship, so it's not patronizing, I'm not speaking for other groups, but to recognize when my voice can help to address a particular issue and interrupt this system of white privilege or advantage.
So, Alan, can you understand, and Carla, I'm asking you the same question, why people of color then get so angry? The woman talked about how she had to go through all these different thought patterns in her head in terms of how to react to what she knew was white privilege.
I would find that exhausting. I can only imagine it because I don't experience that as a white man. But to be second-guessing every situation that I'm in, having to wonder, is this about race? Is this not about race? Am I being paranoid? It's exhausting to have to do that. And so part of my privilege as a white man is that I don't have to devote my energy to all that second guessing and trying to figure it out. Not to mention then deciding how am I going to respond? Am I going to be angry, not angry? I don't have to do any of that, which frees me up tremendously.
I think that
Carla?
hits the nail on the head, because when I finally came to my understanding, well, for me, what privilege is I don't have to worry. I don't have to worry. The rules are made for me, and the rules are not made for other people. And so you have to figure out, in your experience, how to cope with rules that are not in your favor. Mm-hmm. And it's easy for me to float through the world. And it's a matter of intention, as you said. You have to intentionally address this, and you have to want to do it. And I think a lot of people don't want to do it, and it would become tiring for them. They don't want to go through the reflection that it requires.
Okay, let's go back to the phones, 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Give us a call. Tell us what you think about white privilege. John joins us from Newport News. Hi, John. You're on the air.
Hello. I want to see what your panel and the listeners think about the fact that there is a religion prevalent in this country and around the world that props up white people as God, and all of the biblical figures were depicted as white people. And to me, that's the impetus for a lot of racism and possibly even the slave trade. So white folks just felt superior to people of other races. I just want to put that out there to see what your panel and the listeners think about that.
Okay, John, thanks so much for the call. Jonathan, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I think the messaging that surrounds us certainly informs who has subconscious senses of superiority or inferiority. So within religious contexts, who do I see as being God or godlike? In schools, who do I see being reflected in American history, quote unquote, or on the bulletin boards? When I look in pop culture, who do I see represented? So I think when this becomes the background and context, it's, again, not something that's overtly happening. It's not about individual acts of meanness, but this is surrounding us and saying who has power, who doesn't, who belongs, or who's on the outside.
Carl, I want to ask you, since you mentor an African-American family, as you said, now they're a part of your family, what do you say to particularly the young lady as she's growing up? What kinds of things do you talk to her about so that she will be able to cope and to deal with white privilege?
Oh, we've been very frank with one another about things, and we talk about why things are the way they are. WHRO produced a wonderful program on code switching, and we watched that together as a family. So I could say, so when I'm trying to help you with your homework, I only speak this one language, and that's the language that we speak in school. You get to speak your other language when you're not in school. And that was one of the things that we had to cope with, that my language trumps your language in a school situation. And it was very difficult because she thought in that language. She didn't think in the other language. And that was a problem. But we talked about hard things. We talked about slavery. When I was reading all my books, I would share them with them. We would talk about how they can't go back in their family tree much past great-great-grandmother. They have no idea. So I learned a lot about what, in addition to, imparting wisdom to them, they imparted a lot of wisdom to me, and it was all very enlightening.
Well, Amy joins us from Suffolk. Hi, Amy. You're on the air.
Hi, Barbara. It's great talking to you.
Thank you.
I wanted to say that I've been doing a lot of research recently because I am also in a long-standing interracial marriage, and my kids, no one would walk up to them and think that they were black ever. And that's been really interesting for me because I have never had that as an issue. But we have not discussed so far in your radio show who exactly is white, because having looked back at history, deciding who is white and who gets granted these privileges is a really messy issue. Especially in Virginia, where you had people who were claiming Native American descent but wanted white privilege, and people whose birth certificates were changed, arbitrarily without their consent or knowledge even, to be something that was not whites for tax advantages or land advantages or having things privileges taken away from them.
Okay, then let's talk about that. Alan?
I think the first thing to be aware of around the whole idea of race as we use it is that it's not based in reality. Actually, the way I'd really describe it is it's crazy, because it's based on a complete fiction. And so you get, at various times in history, the Irish were not considered to be white, Greeks, Italians, Jews, Muslims. I mean, it's just, and who gets included as white depends upon the interests of the people who are in a cultural position to make that decision.